French seam. Garments made of straight seam or double-stitched seam have a raw edge, and that is the advantage of the French seam over these seams. The French seam's raw edge is completely self-enclosed and the seam has a very neat finish. For higher quality products and garments, one would sew a French seam. And it is this French seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives: at the end of this class, you will be able to identify a French seam, sew a French seam. What is a French seam? This is what the French seam looks like. In a French seam, the raw edges of the fabric are fully enclosed for a neat finish. The French seam is used for lightweight fabrics. Let's see how to do a French seam on a sample. The procedure of sewing the French seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: cotton fabric, straight ruler, tailor's square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of cotton fabric. Measure and draw 10-inch by 10-inch square on it with the help of a ruler, tailor's square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now, take one of the fabric pieces and lay it on the table with its right side up. Using a tailor's square, measuring tape, and tailor's chalk, mark a 1/2-inch seam allowance along one of its cut edges. Now pin the 2 pieces with the wrong side together with the marked seam line on the upper side. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Leave the reverse stitch lever and stitch along the seam line with a normal stitch length. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 4. Trim the seam allowance. Trim the seam allowances to about 1/8 inch. Step 5. Press the seam allowance. Press fabric and open seam allowance with an iron. Then fold the fabric right sides together and press the seam with the encased seam allowance. Step 6. Stitch along the fold. Mark a stitching line 1/4 inch from the fold and pin it. Then stitch along the line. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 7. Press the finished seam line. Press the seam and then open the fabrics so that the right sides are no longer together. Then press the finished seam allowance to one side. Finally, you have your sample with the French seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only, so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching the fabric. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. This is what the French seam looks like. Here, the raw edges of the fabric are fully enclosed for a neat finish. This seam is used for lightweight fabrics. The procedure of sewing the French seam, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Step 4. Trim the seam allowance. Step 5. Press the seam allowance. Step 6. Stitch along the fold. Step 7. Press the finished seam line. This is the French seam. So now you have learned all about the French seam. Take our next class to learn about the flat fell seam.